Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we're going to talk about the explosion of low Earth orbit, or LEO, satellite constellations, and the growth of artificial intelligence and the effect it'll have on these constellations, both from a technical and a business perspective. To guide us through this topic, we have Nathan De Ruiter, Managing Director of Euroconsult Canada, and Scott Herman, CEO of Cognitive Space, which recently raised $4 million in seed funding for its artificial intelligence-based software designed to manage imaging satellite constellations. Now, Nathan had an experience with the Constellations Podcast a year ago, only done minor mental damage to him, but he survived it somehow. Scott, question for you. Cognitive Space has been selected to participate in the Amazon Web Services Space Accelerator, a business support program for startups seeking to use AWS to help solve the biggest challenges in the space industry. Scott, tell us what it's all about and the role of AI as it relates to Earth observation data.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. So Cognitive Space is really helping organizations fly their satellites, particularly new space entities that are launching new satellite constellations. We do that by bringing the power of artificial intelligence to the realm of mission management, collection planning, order management, and comms link coordination. A lot of the new space companies are thinking about how they're going to build out their ground segment architecture. And ground segment isn't simply comms, it's how do you monetize the satellites, how do you bring them to market, how do you take orders from customers and partners, how do you deconflict that, and then how do you tell the satellites what to do? And this is really where the AI comes in. We use artificial intelligence, a technique called reinforcement learning, to determine potential solutions, potential combinations of how to task the satellites to best meet the expectations of customers. They can be tuned for revenue, they can be tuned for capacity, they can be tuned for revisit or monitoring. There's a lot of different factors that kind of go into that. And what that allows companies to do is basically have a buy versus build decision around how they build out their ground segment. A lot of companies are facing this 2 to 3 years of non-recurring engineering and technical risk, schedule risk. So using a service like Cognitive Space allows them to monetize their satellites, focus on the payloads, and be ready to go to business as their satellites launch. AI is a key component of that in determining how those satellites are being put to work every day.
I'm going to ask the gentleman with the space socks there, Nathan.
You like them?
Yeah.
There's another prize today, by the way.
Another prize, his socks, if you ask a question. Nathan, the application of artificial intelligence to Earth observation data is just at its infancy. I guess it's primarily focused on computer vision applications with very high-resolution satellite imagery. But other applications, including mineral deposit extraction, disaster mitigation, agricultural development, and even intelligence gathering will increasingly benefit from artificial intelligence. So, will that lead to new types of value chains?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think it's a very important kind of point of view, what we have seen in market. So if you take a step back, a few years ago we talked about bottlenecks in Earth observation, and it was a lot about supply or the right data sets not being available. Now we've seen a lot of new data sets coming to the market with the new constellation capabilities. And the next step is really building and developing the analytics around it. So the data image has a certain value, certainly, but the real skill or upside opportunity in this segment is really developing analytics products. And to your point, there are really a number of end-user applications that are, potentially interesting, but all very, very different, right? Selling into mineral extraction versus agriculture is a completely different set of distributors, resellers, as well as end users. So there's really needs kind of to be this formation of a value chain or an ecosystem around those applications still needs to be built. I think for satellite companies, it's going to be one of the biggest kind of challenge or efforts to become integrated into that different kind of user sets. And one of the things that we also seen is obviously you can, as a Earth observation company, you can target multiple applications, but at the end you need to focus typically on one of those specific kind of application areas to be really successful, to really be integrated well in that too. So yeah, this is at the start, as you mentioned, and I think that market is going to expand pretty rapidly, but in all different ways.
Scott, we're recording this in Washington, D.C. at the Satellite Conference, and all kinds of people walk around us here looking for opportunities, aren't they? Yeah, looking for opportunities. But there's some challenges that involve these large LEO constellations, including something called adjacent satellite interference and growing space debris fields. Scott, so what's the role of AI in these two challenges?
So the way to think about the way we're applying AI to the satellites is we're helping task the satellites and help them understand what they can and can't do during their mission. Part of that are things like, where are other satellites at? Do I have stable station keeping? Do I have to do a maneuver to avoid collision, and does that impact my ability to generate revenue by collection? In general, we're pretty fortunate that while there's a lot of focus on the space debris problem, most satellites don't have to deal with it, every single minute of the day. They're not dodging and weaving through space. But you do have to think about, are there potential collision events, and how do you manage that? As more and more satellites are going up into space and it gets more crowded, the idea of how do you schedule, how do you coordinate the positioning of the satellites, the maneuverability of the satellites, the station keeping of the satellites, there's definitely a role for AI in that. The other thing that AI can do is help you understand situational awareness of what's actually happening in space. So it's not so much about your satellite, it's about knowing where the other 10,000 satellites are and being able to understand not only satellites, but all of the other things that are floating around out there that could impact your mission and your ability to complete it.
Nathan, we're in downtown Washington, D.C. If you walk into a federal agency and talk to a CIO, every 3 seconds you have to say the word cybersecurity. It's like a mandate, you know what I mean? So, and this is also a challenge in the area of mega constructions. Satellite and terrestrial networks continue to interface, and as both become more and more reliant on the cloud, the cyber attack surface will continue to expand. So AI, machine learning, can help mitigate that risk, or where does it fit in?
Yeah, a little bit of both, right? It creates some additional cybersecurity risks potentially too, but yeah, it is also the way to put additional measures in place and to detect and certain anomalies. But certainly, I think it's a cybersecurity is maybe around mega constellations is something that is maybe not discussed enough, I think, in my point of view. And it's not only about the space assets, but it's a lot about the ground infrastructure, which is going to be exponentially grown or increased over time, which to kind of make sure that the ability to use the connectivity from the constellation. So there's a much more investment required, and honestly, it's probably difficult to see right now what are the risks. And obviously, if you could use AI for helping identifying some of those risks, extra protection measures. But again, the problem sometimes with AI as well, to build really very good, solid AI products, you need a lot of data sets. And if you're venturing into a very new area, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to see. So we will be dependent on a lot of smart people as well to secure.
One of these smart people is Scott. So, Scott, you read the news reports. Even over this weekend, commercial news talks about cybersecurity in the federal government, increasing concern. I think one of the people at the FBI said they have to look into more cybersecurity. So where does it fit in, AI, ML, and satellite security from your perspective?
So in terms of cybersecurity, a lot of AI, ML is being put against the monitoring of massive amounts of web logs, right? It's a real-time activity and also forensic activity to kind of go through and figure out what's been happening within my network and do I have problems there. I think related to Earth observation and satellites, though, there's a special cybersecurity problem that people don't think about as much, and that is the ability to actually change the data itself to represent something different in the images, right? So did you actually see what you thought you saw on the ground? This idea of what's called a chain of custody and protection of the satellite data is becoming increasingly important. It's not just an attack that might be a denial of service or a penetration. It's actually the product. If I'm taking satellite images of Ukraine and I can insert tanks where they don't belong, or I can pull tanks out that ability to make sure that the veracity of the data is secure is a special cybersecurity concern that relates to Earth observation data.
So Nathan, I get to use a big fancy word here, so hold on to yourself, hold on to your chair here. The global space marketplace, and some projected, is expected to approach $1 trillion by 2030. I mean, that's a huge number. The number of satellites could grow to 50,000 if commercial plans for mega constellations pan out. As my daughter says, what could possibly go wrong? A lot of problems here. You know, a report issued by Credit Suisse stated that there is economically only room for about 3 large-scale LEO constellations. And if these LEO constellations continue to be deployed, it could lead to destruction of value within the sector. Everyone should tune up and listen to that. So, what's the issue? Is it the number of constellations or the number of satellites within them, Nathan? Which one is it?
Good question. I think it's probably not necessarily even both, and I don't actually fully agree with the statement because there's a number of things to unpack. So first, 50,000 satellites, yes, if you look at all the filings, you add it up, you probably even can go beyond that, but the interest of satellite constellation as well, you can scale your constellation, you need to have a minimum base to operate a service, but then, you know, when the demand grows, you can scale out your constellation. So whether they will really get to the 50,000 or somewhere below and still have a very meaningful business, I think it's somewhere. The other thing is there are only 3, probably not. I think one of the things that you've seen right now as well with the the Ukraine invasion, and if you look at what's happening there in Europe, there's bigger things in play than just the pure economics. So if you look at even like, for example, OneWeb, they got a support from the UK government. If you look at Telesat and SpaceX, they started off with government support. So governments have a certain interest in bringing connectivity. And on top of that, if you look at what is happening right now in terms of military conflict, so other kind of interest of sovereignty and protection comes into place, and I think constellations have a significant role to play. So all in all, I believe there is room for more than 3. If you look at pure from the economics, it might be more difficult to have everybody a very spectacular return when we're going all together at the same time in the market. It's going to be a very interesting time because a lot of them will enter at the same time. But $1 trillion, I hope so. 2030 will be soon. But again, we're happy to see in the next few years how we're getting near that.
Scott, a lot of economists write and they talk about limits to growth. So what do you think on this topic? Do you think there's 50,000 is a limit or 3 constellations? Is there a limit to this growth?
I don't. And with all due respect to Credit Suisse, I strongly disagree with that comment. I think that, like most technological revolutions, there are going to be waves of consolidation and then flowering of lots of new startups and new business models and new ideas, and then a consolidation again. Certainly, the room that the mega constellations take up is something to think about. But space is a really big place, and it has to be managed, and you have to find room. But I think that one of the things that's really exciting about what's happening right now in the new space revolution is the opportunity for lots and lots and lots of new companies, new business models, new technologies to be applied. If I thought that there was only going to be 3 mega constellations, I would very, very much niche that into things like broadband internet access, right? Because then it's a competitive play. How many players can be in that particular niche? But when you talk about the realm of space and all the different missions that can go on, IoT, remote sensing observation, the wide variety of use cases around national security monitoring, economic monitoring, environmental monitoring, there's a lot of room up there. There's a lot of business models. There's a lot of money flowing into the space. And I think we'll see phenomenal growth over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And I don't see space as a limiting factor for that.
So, Nathan, we have a prediction of 50,000 satellites, and then there's something called utilization of those satellites. Is it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? It probably isn't, These LEO constellations may be global, but only a fraction of these satellites may be actively servicing subscribers at any time. Some estimates are between 4 and 25%. So since utilization is a key ingredient in a constellation's success, can LEO constellations sustain themselves with these utilization rates?
Yeah, another good question, actually. So utilization rates obviously is one when you're scaling up, right, your constellation. So even if you're ramping up your demand, you're adding new supply. So especially in the ramp-up period, the utilization rates will be, relatively low. Flip side, you do need, utilization to keep financing, expanding your capabilities. and the constellations. Now, when we look at where demand is, it's pretty, I think, often discussed and I'm talking here primarily on the broadband side, but because I think that's, you can maybe talk about it on the Earth observation side. It's much more concentrated in areas than we typically think. So we do have seen in the kind of next generation of constellations, there's more, the architecture that's built on to be able to pull and push more capacity in where the areas where it's needed. And as you pointed out, of course, like 9 a.m. Around Boston, there's a lot of airplanes go out, but there's nothing yet on the West Coast. So be able to dynamically allocate capacity around certain geographic areas, that will help utilization rates, because you can make a better use and allocate this capacity at different places at different time when it's needed. But there's always trade-off, and there's always a maximum that you can do. So if you look at from the old world of how we've seen it, geo satellite world was always ramping up to 80%. This is not what we're going to expect to see for constellations. So it's a different mindset. It doesn't mean a utilization, you cannot close your business case if you don't read the same utilization rate. So we need to look at it differently.
Well, Scott, you live in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a podcast in town called Feds at the Edge. It talks about edge computing. That's where I want to head now. Traditionally, satellites, they collect the data and they transmit it back to Earth and, pull out what's good, what's bad, and delete the rest. So is there a role for artificial intelligence or onboard computing to streamline and do the data analysis and extraction up there in the sky? What do you think?
There is. I'll put a big asterisk on it because there are some constraints. You've got compute power constraints. You've got innovation cycle constraints. When I do innovation on the ground, I can deploy every few hours, right? If I'm putting capability up in space, that could be measured in months or even years. So there are some downsides to saying, let's just push everything to the edge. There are real requirements. Certainly, defense and intelligence has concerns about resiliency in a conflict environment. But in general, I think the way to think about it isn't we're going to push AI to the edge and that's where it's going to live, or it belongs on the ground and you get this religious war. The way to think about it is as a hybrid. What are the use cases in space that lend themselves to AI? So, for example, if you're doing Earth observation with a visible light sensor, being able to do things like, this picture was really cloudy, I shouldn't waste the bandwidth to downlink it, that's a pretty compelling case, right? Now you get into some other issues like licensing. Do you take the shot? Do you got to get it down to the ground anyway to archive it? But in general, there are use cases where you can have some amount of AI processing in space to help out. I think the goal in the long term, the Skynet goal, right, where you have complete autonomy within space and the satellites are talking to each other in these peer-to-peer networks and you don't need the ground, or the ground is really used as overseeing. I think that's where we're headed, but you have to be really careful because the amount of compute power, the amount of innovation is on the ground. It's not in a 50 kilogram or even a 500 kilogram satellite in space. Also, if you're a small company and you're building a commercial satellite constellation, the dumber those satellites are, the faster you can rev them, the cheaper you can get them up. So there's a lot of trade-offs there. So there are very legitimate reasons to push AI to the edge in space, but it's not a blanket, requirement that we're suddenly going to be Skynet in 5 years.
I've heard of small satellites. I just heard about dumb satellites. I have to put that in my little terminology list. So, Nathan, are you on the edge? What about edge computing? What are the economics of this whole edge computing idea?
Yeah, no, I think, again, it's a lot about the trade-offs that Scott mentioned. So I think, there is, if you can make more efficient use of as you pointed out, especially in the Earth observation kind of world. But again, I still think they're going to be a bit limited. And in the defense side, I assume still most of them, they want to do all their own analytics. So there is some efficiency gain, but I don't, in my view, but maybe Scott have actually a different point of view. I don't think it has a very substantial kind of cost economic advantage. There's some.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just to follow up, I think another use case that you hear a lot in kind of the monitoring and Earth observation world is, let's process the image on the satellite and do object extraction and detection so that we can tip and cue other satellites. So I take a picture, I instantly see there's a Russian tank column. I'm going to now cue other satellites in my peer-to-peer network. That's a really exciting use case. You don't have to take the time to get back down to the ground, process it, come up with a new plan, and get it up there. There are programs that are exploring these concepts right now. So I think we'll see more and more AI pushing to the edge. I would just caution people that it's not a giant jump and you leave the ground behind. There are really compelling reasons to not do all your stuff on the edge.
Well, you use the word tank, so I guess it's time to make a transition from commercial space to military space. Cognitive space recently completed an experiment with military and intelligence agencies. So tell us about this experiment, and do you see it as the future of AI in military space applications?
Yeah, so what Cognitive Space has been doing through a number of SBIR contracts with some different government agencies is really helping the U.S. government and its allies understand what they're going to be able to do with these new wave of commercial capabilities. So it's defense use of commercial capabilities, primarily around remote sensing. And so what we do is we go out to exercises and we test these concepts, and we test the requirements, and we test the capabilities of the commercial providers. So, for example, we just finished an exercise called Arctic Edge, where we were orchestrating collection across a number of commercial suppliers and applying that to real-world use cases, like custody of moving objects on the ground. We did Joint Warrior last year, where we orchestrated collection across 500 different satellites and ground stations across about 14 different suppliers, both commercial and government satellites. And part of what we're doing with the AI is we're determining things like what's the optimal use of these satellites against a particular mission problem, what are the tipping and queuing opportunities, what's the coverage opportunities, what's the revisit opportunities. Revisit is a really important concept for global monitoring. You don't just shoot one and done. You might want it 5 times a day. You may want it 10 times a day. You may only need it 3 times a week. But those monitoring requirements drive a lot of the defense and intelligence use cases, for example, ISR. And it's this new wave of commercial capability where you're flying swarms of satellites, you're flying them in all kinds of interesting orbits, you're getting these very, very high revisit. It's not the traditional mapping or what we're called foundation geoint missions. It's about monitoring, it's about ISR, and that's why things like latency and timing and tasking become very, very important. That's where we're applying our artificial intelligence.
We are recording this from the satellite show. I see people in uniforms in the audience and running around here, so I got to be careful about this. I may get in real big trouble here. Let's stick to this topic of the military space a little bit here. So AI is being used in evaluating the classification of observation data from LEO constellations. We know that. And these serve national security applications such as missile defense. So putting you on the spot here, without divulging privileged information, maybe a little expansion on this concept?
Yeah, so I think of the application of artificial intelligence to satellites in 2 primary categories. One is, how do you tell the satellites what to do? Right? Most of these satellites are robots. They're taskable. You're going to say, take a picture here, turn, take a picture there. Now downlink your data. Rinse and repeat, thousands of times per day. The other place where AI really gets applied is in the exploitation of the data coming from the satellites. So when we think about controlling the satellites, we use techniques like reinforced learning. When we think about the exploitation of the data, that's more the realm of computer vision, right? We're taking data, or it may be computer vision. There are other techniques. You may have data that's not pixel-based. You may have other types of AI techniques. You may go against different kinds of data. But the idea is that there's AI for exploitation. And many people think about that exploitation of data side as being a volumetric problem. There's so much data coming in, I can't put humans against it anymore like we did with, in the old days. I need computer vision to handle the volume. I would argue that it's actually more exciting, but more nuanced. It's not about how many pixels I need to extract from. It's about this idea of monitoring and latency. I need to be able to do it very, very quickly. I need to be able to do it at a cadence that lets me do pattern of life and operational tempo and monitoring of facilities and activities, and to be able to determine anomalies against that. And that's a much more interesting AI problem than simply I need to replace some human analyst in the loop. It's much, much more about the timing and latency and being able to support new use cases out there. And one of the things the U.S. government and its allies are really supportive of right now is this ISR use case, right? How do we maintain custody of things on the ground? How do we task and tip and queue other assets?
Well, I've been hogging all the questions here. We got 5 minutes. We've got a person with a microphone. So if anyone in the audience wants to win Nathan's socks or a T-shirt, raise your hand. We'll have you ask a question. Anyone out there? There's a gentleman here with a beard.
Hi, thank you very much for this interesting talk. So I wanted to ask if recently I heard Elon Musk said the low Earth orbit can accommodate like 10 billion satellites easily. So if this is the goal, if this is the future, what do you think is going to be the problem with 10 billion satellites in the LEO, for example? Is it going to be data downlink? Is it going to be maneuvering or collision risk? What do you think about it? Is it feasible? Is this the future that's waiting us? Thank you.
I think there's a lot of things to consider here. So yeah, you pointed out like the maneuvering, the debris, that kind of thing. But it's also from a connectivity side of point. There's interference. There's the spectrum rights. There's a lot of things that come into play to reach to the 10 billion. It sounds technically it probably is. If everybody's very disciplined and works together, it's probably feasible. But I think a lot of people will get very nervous with these kind of considerations. There comes a lot into play from a technical side, from a frequency perspective side. So yeah.
So my name is Scott, and I'm a space junk denier. No, I'm kidding. But I think it's really important to think about just how big space actually is, right? And how much room there is for things out there. Now, unfortunately, those things are moving really fast, right? They're moving Mach 25. And when they hit something, it's bad news. And you do get this kind of cascading chain reaction domino effect that everybody's really concerned about. The other thing that's really a factor is there is no global body doing air traffic control and setting all the standards. It's fairly Wild West. If you want to put something up in space, go for it, right? If you're a U.S. company, you've got to coordinate with the FCC and NOAA and some other agencies. But in general, whoever gets there first gets there. There's actually a really interesting company out there right now that wants to put tiny, tiny satellites in a grid around the Earth to basically do domain poaching, right? To be able to take that space and go, we've got it, now we're going to sell it for somebody else when it comes along. So all kinds of really interesting business models headed our way. The other thing that's really interesting about the space debris problem is that it's not universally distributed, right? The argument I made about how big space is would scale if everything was equally distributed. But for example, when we talk about Earth observation satellites, most Earth observation satellites, this is changing, but most of them actually fly in almost the exact same set of orbits. It's called a sun-synchronous polar orbit. And they position themselves to take pictures between 10 and 12 over local time over the Earth, because that's when you get the best lighting for mapping products. So what that means is that you have a whole bunch of satellites that are flying together. It's almost like a NASCAR race, right? You're sitting in the stands, it's quiet for a minute, and suddenly a whole bunch of cars race by. So I think when you think about things like space situational awareness or space traffic management, these are very real issues that will be obstacles to getting to the billion satellites in the sky. But there are many different bodies that are kind of trying to figure that out. There are many techniques around how do you react to space situational awareness. There's a lot of startups that are chasing this problem. A lot of them are at this show here trying to figure it out. I think the other comment I would make, and it goes to comms, and one of the constraints is if they're up in space, you're probably trying to get data down, right? And whether that's telecom or observation data, one of the things that could potentially be a game changer is the role of space-based relay. So you don't have to worry about a finite set of ground stations and coordinating and queuing up and waiting your turn and waiting to fly over it before you can get it. Space-based relay basically becomes a backhaul in space, and that could really help scale up the number of satellites you can support.
Well, Scott, if you don't believe in junk, you should see my garage. It's just full of junk. We are running out of time here, unfortunately. This has been a wide-ranging discussion. We've talked everything from artificial intelligence to the intelligence community. I'd like to thank our guests, Nathan De Ruiter, Managing Director of Euroconsult Canada, and Scott Herman, CEO of Cognitive Space. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.